Hello, everyone. On behalf of Clemson University Center for Workforce Development, I would like to thank each of you for joining us in this continued webinar series. This is the fourth webinar in our series of webinars. I'm Tammy Queenie, and I'm an instructional designer with CUCWD, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have missed the previous webinars, I have mentioned the link in this chat thread. Feel free to look them up at your convenience. Our topic for today, selecting instructional media, considerations, examples, and resources, will be presented by Dr. Logan Arrington. You can find Dr. Arrington's bio in the link that I have mentioned in this chat thread. Before we proceed, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. Firstly, this is a 1-hour webinar, and this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view later. Secondly, all participants are muted except for the presenters. As we'd like to encourage questions, please send them through this chat thread during this session, or later, you can email us at cucwd@clemson.edu. We'll be answering any additional questions towards the end of this session. Given our time frame today, if we are unable to answer your questions during this hour, we'd be sure to follow up with you later. And lastly, we'd encourage you to share today's webinar with your network. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by introducing our presenter for today, Dr. Logan Arrington, who graduated with a PhD in instructional systems and learning technologies from my alma mater, Florida State University. He is presently the assistant professor of instructional technology at the University of West Georgia. His research focuses on 3 primary topics: learning from failure, professional issues in the field of instructional design and technology, authentic learning experiences for underrepresented groups. At the University of West Georgia, Dr. Arrington is involved in a variety of projects, but one of the most interesting is his involvement with the Mobile Innovations Lab. It's a 42-foot trailer that brings innovative technology-enhanced activities to students in rural schools. The intent of the activities is to facilitate the development of 21st century skills for learners in these rural areas. These activities are centered on specific skill development that is strengthened through the meaningful use of technology tools. For example, robotics, coding, modeling, virtual reality, etc. I believe Dr. Arrington is the best presenter to help us all focus on how to select appropriate media in our instructional process. Before we proceed with the webinar, we'd appreciate if you could all take a short survey right now, as this will help us understand our participants better. And we will all pause for a few seconds to allow everyone to complete the survey. I believe the survey will pop up any minute and you would see the survey. there's the first question, and if you look below, you have a second question popping up on your screen also. Well, thank you all so much for completing the survey. Dr. Arrington, we request you to read the survey results and share them with all our participants. And you now have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tammy. All right, let me pop. I'll wait for the surveys to pop up. It's still not on my end. While we wait, I do kind of, before I kind of move into the introductory, up there it is. Actually, I'm going to talk just 1 second about this, and then I'll read the survey, and then I'll kind of start the presentation. So I just wanted to share a couple of little pictures really quickly of our Mobile Innovations Lab in action. So you can kind of see here, as Tammy mentioned, it is a 42-foot trailer. We've got it nice and wrapped now. And really the primary purpose behind it is kind of targeting rural schools in our area, because here in Carrollton, Georgia, we're located within really close proximity to Metro Atlanta, but we're not like, it's not an urban area, or even, it's kind of more suburban, but we have a lot of rural and town-sized schools as well. So we really, really love this opportunity to get out and provide access to these students. So just kind of wanted you all to kind of get to see what that looked like. All right, so now before I do this, I'll pop this back over. So hopefully y'all all can see that. I'm going to make it big so I can see it better as well. So here's the results of the poll. So we can see we've got 6 instructors, a manufacturer here, 3 researchers, a student. We've got 8 staff, we have 8 faculty, and then we have 2 other. So a lot with university education, some with 2 years college foundation, and then also lastly, we have 4 with other. All right. So Tammy, anything else, or can I dive right in?
Yeah, we can now go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Arrington.
Okay. It's so weird hearing her call me Dr. Arrington too, by the way. So if you cannot tell, I'm actually a very informal presenter. So anytime that you all have questions throughout, feel free to use that chat thread. I'll do my best to pop over there and look, and we can answer. And I have a couple things that I kind of want to ask you all to have an opportunity to share as well as we're going through. So today we're talking about selecting instructional media, and as Tammy said, considerations, examples, and resources. So first off, when you hear the terminology instructional media, it's kind of, you might like hesitate, right? You might like have a double take. And I'll tell you that we, at my university, our department or our area, our program area used to be called media. And we consistently had people asking us about like our newscasting programs and things like that. So that's not the type of media that we're talking about. So we're not talking about members of the media. Today, we're talking about instructional media. And so in our next slide, we'll be diving into kind of looking at, after we go through kind of like our overview, we'll be talking about what is instructional media and what are some definitions of that. So here's kind of the overview for the presentation today. Kind of the big guiding question is, how do we, and we being whatever situation we're in, as an instructor, as a faculty member, as like even someone that's interested in training on the job, how do we select instructional media and specifically tools that are appropriate for us and get the job done? And so you can see there those topic slides. Those are just going to be kind of like the themes that we're going to kind of dive into a little bit as we work our way through this presentation. All right, so to start with, so what are instructional media? So when we think about instructional media, there's 3 kind of categories that can be used. And I did not come up with these 3 perspectives or these 3 categories. These are based on the work of Richard Clark, who's one of the pioneers of media and multimedia and how media impacts learning. And I have some of those resources linked at the very end of the presentation for those interested. So from those 3 perspectives, we've got media as vehicles. So that these are like kind of the tools or the technologies that we actually use. So, it's like as a vehicle, could something be like a PowerPoint is kind of a vehicle. So vehicle is kind of like our base level consideration. Then we've got media as vehicles plus strategies. So this is going to be like, when we're using specific media and incorporating like different strategies, such as like collaborative learning or something like that into it. And then the broader is kind of media as the overarching learning context. So this is going to mean like, this is like a much broader kind of as media means, our learning environment itself. So that's going to be, like our online platforms, or even kind of like our face-to-face, environment, kind of. So the context of, where the learning is taking place. So those are kind of three, I think, they're obviously all interrelated. But I think for the intent of our presentation today, I want us to focus on media from a tool perspective. And I think that of the three categories and the perspectives that Clark discusses, I really think media as a vehicle is where we're going to kind of focus today. So we're going to be thinking about the types of vehicle and talk a little bit about some strategies, because typically it's hard to talk about just a tool without having some planned strategies included in there. But really, we're going to be thinking about media as a vehicle for learning through this presentation. So that tool perspective, so again, this is kind of my definition, just to kind of hopefully make things a little easier. Throughout this presentation, you'll kind of hear me, I'll possibly use media and tool interchangeably, or use them at the same time, but we're talking about the same thing. So again, probably not a surprise, you're going to see some of those same keywords that we had on that last slide. Instructional tools, I'm defining as those specific forms of media that serve as vehicles for learning. So again, the tools that we're using to support learning. So now I want to take a break from talking, and I want to ask you all, so what are some of the types of tools that you like to use in your instruction? So you can think about this from a couple of different ways. You can think about tools that you like to use to present, to disseminate. You can think about it as tools that you like students to use, you like learners to use. So you can think about it from those different perspectives. You can also think about it from kind of that broad perspective. So like the generic forms of media. So this might be more so that we don't identify a very specific tool, but we identify a strategy, or we identify a specific tool that kind of lets us use that strategy. So again, just thinking about this, what are some kind of technologies or tools that you all integrate? So I'm going to pause. I saw one answer come in. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we'll talk about some things. Awesome. So I've seen two people mention video assignments. That's all, like video assignments and getting students to, not only, having them consume videos, always very good, but then also having them be content creators and creating videos of things, very good. It's a good practice. Soft chalk, that's one I'm not familiar with. So I'm going to make a note, and I'm going to look more into it as we after this this presentation. Soft chalk. So I saw also social media, integrating social media and using a lot of social platforms. I think those are good tools as well. And you can find that a lot of them allow for a lot of the similar things that, certain discussion boards are, depending on like your LMS. So again, I really like discussion boards too. And one of the examples we'll talk about a little later is kind of through the use of discussion boards, but it's kind of like a little bit of tweaking that goes along with it. All right, so we've got e-portfolios. So portfolios, and then kind of like, condensing work, or, not condensing, that's probably not organizing work in meaningful ways are great techniques and great tools to use. And there's a variety of different tools that you can kind of use along with e-portfolios. Let's see, video, create and consume. Okay, cool. I'm definitely going to look into soft chalk. And then Google Drive. Oh, I actually integrate Google Drive a lot in my classes, in my teaching, and I'll talk a little bit about that because I have kind of an example that that kind of goes along with the presentation. So awesome. So thank y'all so much for sharing. I got a couple more instances where I'm going to ask y'all some stuff, and so please feel free to share at any time. So I think that a lot of times when people are picking the tools that they're going to use, that they're going to incorporate in their teaching, that they're really thinking about it from this perspective. They want something, they want a tool that does something cool. And so one of the reasons why they want that is they want it to be clean, they want it to be sleek, they want it to be engaging and capture the learner's intent, their learner's attention. And that's important. However, I wanted to kind of transition into what I'm kind of calling some myths and legends of instructional design and technology. So from my perspective, I work a lot currently with K-12 educators. And so these are two myths that I encounter a lot when I'm interacting with them. So I hope that, hopefully that this is all old news to you guys, but if not, I wanted to kind of use it because I think it frames the rest of our conversation that we're going to have. So the first is that if so as an instructor, use a variety of technological tools, students will be engaged and learn more. So we should know that just the integration of technology doesn't necessarily lead to more student learning or even to more engagement. It's not always going to be the case. So this is a really common mindset that at least I encounter when working with my students, is that they think about, well, I've got to use these tools because like these students they need to be engaged. And while tools can definitely do that and play a role in engagement, they obviously play a role in the classroom environment. They are not drivers themselves or drivers alone. So kind of, going along with that is this other myth, another very popular myth is, so learners who grew up with the internet and grew up with computers and laptops and mobile devices are more technologically savvy. So maybe you all have heard the terminology digital natives before. And so digital natives are those people. And so what kind of research has shown us is that kind of really digital natives don't exist. They obviously, like learners of this age group, or some proportion of learners, are better suited to integrate and to learn technology tools or technology programs a lot quicker. But it's not all of them. Probably also no surprise is that typically it's students or learners that grew up in a more affluent household that had more access to these types of programs or devices. So I think that, we kind of have to dispel those two things. That, again, like I said, hopefully these are things that you all are aware of. But if not, I think it's important for us to dispel those two things before we kind of move forward with our conversation on selecting tools. So the last thing before we kind of move into what do we consider when we're picking appropriate tools? I wanted to talk just really briefly about the SAMR model. So if you've never heard of the SAMR model, don't worry about it. It's not like a super revolutionary thing, and it's called a model, but the systems person in me thinks it's more of a framework because it's not really like a process. So this framework just kind of exists to kind of help us think about how we're integrating technology into our instructional practice. And so there's 4 levels that go along with this model, and they each represent a letter in that SAMR acronym. So we've got substitution, augmentation, modification, and then redefinition. And so substitution is just simply where you're kind of replacing something that can be done in a no-tech environment or a low-tech environment with tech. And I have examples of kind of each phase along the way on the next slide. Augmentation is going to be when tech kind of allows for a little bit of added functionality, but it's kind of just like maybe removing steps that would usually occur in that face-to-face or that no-tech environment. Modification is going to be where you really have totally changed the task and what the task is about. So you're using technology to change what the task might be. And then redefinition is now we're doing tasks that couldn't typically be done without the use of technology. We've totally kind of changed the game. And typically you're going to see in modification and redefinition, you're going to see a lot of overlap with them, but you're going to also kind of see that this is going to be where we shift away from thinking about technology integration from an instructor perspective and think about it from a learner perspective. So when you think about modification, and a redefinition, you're really thinking about students as content creators, or students are going to be creating instructional materials themselves in a way. So before we go too deep into SAMR, there's a couple of things that I kind of wanted to talk. SAMR is not perfect. I think there's I have a lot of criticism for this framework, but I think it's a really good way to just kind of think about, integration of technology. The other thing about it is with almost everything in our lives, it's very context dependent. So it's really going to kind of depend on contextual factors. So when you think about the integration of technology, you might be thinking about a task that's already established versus kind of creating new tasks, if that makes sense. So that contextual element of it is kind of important too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress. Okay, so just really quickly, I hate this slide. Sorry, it's a lot of text. I'm just going to kind of talk through it really quick. So these are some examples of substitution. So like of each level of the SAMR model. So for substitution, pretty common one would be like, okay, instead of like students doing a worksheet or filling out like a piece of paper, we put that into like a Google slide, or a Google Doc or something, and they're working on that instead of actually filling it out. So base level, not really changing the dynamic because like right now, notice no other features of Google Docs are being employed, because like you can use Google Docs to do some of these other elements as well. So then augmentation. So maybe we have students, they're collecting data in a lab and they're actually inputting their data into a Google form, which is allowing them the real-time ability to also analyze that data, right? Like looking at things like descriptives and percentages and that kind of thing. So you can kind of see it is allowing a little bit of augmentation of where they're able to kind of now look at the whole class's data in one instance, whereas instead maybe they just used to previously have their own to look at. So modification. So modification is a kind of tough one because, again, it's kind of back to that context. So, and this is an example of where the context, you couldn't do this in a face-to-face environment, right? So they have a simulation, say, let's say like a nuclear power plant or something that students aren't going to be able to access originally or initially. They're going to have a simulation in this environment that allows them to tweak and play with variables that they couldn't necessarily do because of safety concerns in a real world environment. So this would be a way that you kind of really have changed the task, because they're actually able to modify. They're able to change these things that they usually cannot change or cannot toy with, for the lack of a better phrase. All right, and so then redefinition. So again, as I kind of mentioned on the previous slide, redefinition is really about that kind of content creation. So an example that often comes up of redefinitions is having students either create learning materials or create assessments based off of content from some form or another. So for this example, I kind of combined some of modification in here to kind of talk about how now students are like creating a quiz over the concepts covered in this simulation for their peers to have to complete to see if they're understanding the concepts. So it's kind of like a little bit of a peer teaching in a way, but it's really kind of a little bit more like peer assessment. So you can kind of see one of the things that I don't like about SAMR is because oftentimes people think about it as I use Google Docs in my first example. So that must mean that Google Docs must always be a substitution. And that's not really the case, because like really with Google Docs, you can have students collaborating, and you can have them not only collaborating like collaborating real time with people that are, say, in the same room as them, but you can have them collaborating real time with people that are across the world, as long as time zone allows. So depending, again, it's really about kind of the context within which the tool is used. All right, so now we're going to talk about kind of selecting tools. So my first question, I guess my second question for you all is, why do you pick the media or the tools that you do? So what are some of the considerations that you all kind of take into account when you're picking a tool? All right, I'm seeing some great answers. So institutional support's a great one, recommended by, hey, great. Okay, I lost track. So Easy to use audience. I saw that mentioned. Platform adoption. Awesome. I think that's going to touch on something. Cost as well. Ease of use and how useful it'll be. Oh yeah, so thinking about, are my students going to be familiar with it? I think that's a really good way to think about it. Student engagement. I think institutional support's a really important one as well. So like, does it allow me to do something like that, that I might not be able to do without it? So kind of like that collaboration. And then accessibility to students. Awesome. So great job, guys. I think you kind of you touched on a little bit of everything that I wanted to kind of touch on, but we'll go through and see. So the one thing that I didn't see mentioned quite as much, and I think it's possibly because it's like an unspoken, right? But I think that the most important thing is, okay, does it, and maybe somebody actually did kind of touch onto this, but does it allow me to meet my objective in an efficient and effective manner? Is it aligned to the objective that I'm trying to teach? So, thinking about that observable behavior or that observable skill that you want the students to be able to do, does this tool really help with that? Or does it have like some hindrance that might go along with that? Because really, I know hopefully you all attended Dr. Vanessa Denon's webinar. If you didn't, definitely make sure to watch that recording when she talked about objectives. I know she talked a little bit about aligning learning tools to objectives, but really that objective and that should guide everything that we do, and even down to our selection of tools. So I definitely saw cost. Cost is definitely a big one, and not just cost across the board, right? Cost for us, cost for the institution, cost for the students. There are a lot of great free tools that are available out there, and I will share some of those in a little bit. I saw that some people mentioned this, and especially thinking about student familiarity. So is there an added burden to the students? So one of the things that I wanted to kind of give you all an example, added burden can be both, it is on the students, right? Because it's like, do the students have to learn the tool? So one of the things that I've encountered, and even even as an instructor, I still sometimes, I think, give too much benefit of the doubt to my learners. So I think it was Mariah was talking about using Google Drive. So I use Google Drive, and we use Google Docs a lot, especially because we do, group-based projects. Because, really, especially in our modern day, it's pretty rare that you'll solve a problem, in a silo. And a lot of my courses deal with problem solving, they're solving either an instructional problem or a performance problem. So I unfortunately make sure to teach my learners how to use Google Docs. Most of them are K-12 educators, and most of them know how to do it with no problem. However, I still have to teach them how to share and turn in assignments appropriately using Google Docs, such as sharing the links, changing the shared privacy settings and things like that. Because if I don't teach them, they're not going to do it correctly, and I'm going to spend 3 times as much time on the back end trying to fix it. So that's the other thing. So part of another added burden to the learner is that, is it going to be difficult for them to learn in addition? And not just, it doesn't have to be them learning themselves, but learning, either with your help or without, because sometimes you can allow learners to learn the tools themselves. Okay, so one other thing that I just wanted to just kind of touch on, and so does it violate kind of some of our principles of media? And so I mentioned Clark. You can Clark and Mayer have these multimedia principles. I'm also really bad because sometimes I do violate them, but it's usually in instances where I'm kind of creating learning that's not, or creating materials that are like this, where I want to have a conversation more than that this is a learning object for you to go back and use at any point or any time. So another that I wanted to touch on too is that it's unfortunately attention spans, and I don't think that this is just generationally thing, but attention spans are getting shorter. So it's always a challenge to have learning material that's easily consumable now. Used to be a lot more simple to where I believe people had longer attention spans, so they could kind of sit, do the same thing a little longer. Now you typically want to see the recommendations, I believe, are 5 to 15 minutes for videos and things like that. Like, so if you're thinking about lecturing and, putting lectures online, or, think about that if there's ways to segment your material so that it's more kind of, I don't really like the term micro learning or anything because it, subsumes macro learning, but micro learning is a really big, it's a really big, a hot topic, but it is kind of, so it's like, are they just easily consumable? So always kind of keep that in mind as well, as so that you're not like throwing like 3 hours worth of a recording at them, or even an hour. So that's why I kind of like to integrate a few of those kind of questions into the conversation. Oh, it's Clark and Mayer. So Mayer. Okay, so we have all these choices of tools that we can use. So I wanted to kind of talk really briefly about kind of selections specifically for online environments, but I really think we kind of touched on a lot of those. I think a lot of what you all mentioned also applies in the online environment, and all of those things were still kind of represented. And then someone also mentioned my other big one that I wanted to touch on in the online environment. So you all don't have to answer this question. So as I kind of said, just, we definitely want to consider all those previous considerations that we were talking about on the former slide. But I think the additional one when we're thinking about online environments are access issues. And there's a variety of different levels of access we can kind of think about. So one is that not all learners have access to the same hardware. I can tell you, as an example, we've actually, been struggling with this a little at my university, or at least I know that there's been struggle. You kind of have to have some flexibility, because unfortunately, while we have computer labs and things available, like, there are like minimum tech requirements for certain courses. Not all learners have access to the tech that they need. So sometimes if you're picking, like, if you're wanting students to edit a video with like Vegas or something that could be a, heavy processing, tool, you should be cognizant of that, or make sure that you're in a spot where you understand your learners and you kind of have a better idea who your learners are, and you know that they have access to that technology. Another big piece is like peripherals. So thinking about like, what like, does it need like accompanying devices or things like that might be an added cost to students that don't have them readily available. I think also, I just wanted to mention back to the hardware, also think about it bandwidth wise as well. Like, is the bandwidth, like, does it take a lot of bandwidth, the tool that you're wanting to use? Because not everyone, unfortunately, has, if COVID's taught us anything else, it's that internet access and reliable broadband or reliable internet is also, an issue that we have to kind of be thinking about. So just make sure that you kind of think about these things, not saying that they have to be always the thing that drives the decision, but just make sure that you're considering them as you're selecting it. And then the other big thing, I think this ties obviously into accessibility, is things like, is the tool or the technology that you're using, does it meet ADA, which is, the American Disability Act, I believe, and then 508 compliance, which is another that's used a lot with media and things that you create. 508, they have got these really good checklists. So it's like things like, are you using color to, symbolize right or wrong, or things like that. So because, you should be thinking about your learners that could have like, who are colorblind. So there's all these like little nice things that are built into those resources. And if you're ever kind of interested in making sure that you're working with things that are, you're using compliant tools, a lot of tools have like an ADA and a compliance like statement or policy that you can find on like the tool home site. And then you can also find a lot of good resources for evaluating tools just by Googling, looking for an ADA tool or a 508 compliance like checklist. All right, so I wanted to walk through just kind of two examples of just kind of like a specific tool selection. They're both pretty generic and a little broad, but just kind of, talk through what the intent or what the ideas kind of behind tool selection would be. So probably no surprise, as an instructional designer, I started with my objective. So in this case, we're looking at a manufacturing safety course. And so like specifically, like let's say, probably more so like a safety inspection course, and you're teaching manufacturing safety. So thinking about like, factories and that aspect of it. And so the objective would be, given an unsafe scenario, students will be able to categorize the unsafe areas within the environment with no mistakes. So typically, just as a little sidebar, when we write objectives, we usually don't use criteria that are 100%, so like with no mistakes, unless it deals with safety. When it deals with safety, we want to make sure that things are appropriately identified. So one of the reasons why I wanted to pick this is because, to me, I thought this was a good example of a type of thing that you would probably, kind of have like an off-site experience, right? Where you might typically take students to actually, walk through a factory and look for and, have things staged. So it would be a very authentic experience. And so for the purpose of this activity, and us talking about this, let's say that that's what usually happens, right? Is that the instructor would take students to a nearby manufacturing factory. Let's say that, they manufacture doors and windows, and they would take them and then they would like have it staged essentially so that it was very authentic. However, we know also now with COVID, right, like that's probably not happening because a lot of organizations have safety protocols about letting people in. So, of course, like the activity is that these students need an opportunity to practice. They need an opportunity to practice identifying these scenarios, or identifying the areas of concern within the scenarios, and categorize those based on a certain criteria. So kind of a tool that could be really great, and I'm plugging the CUCWD's resources, is kind of like a virtual simulation, a virtual reality simulation. And so when you think about it too, you can kind of almost, I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit of a hint on one of these answers. You can substitute the actual attendance of a face-to-face experience, actually physically being present within a factory within with a virtual environment. So, and I'll link you. I know that Tammy shared in chat some of those, some of the link to those tools. We also have them later, and I'll kind of show you what, like why I picked this, and I'll actually explain kind of why I picked it here. So obviously the number one, one of our big driving factors was that we were unable to like do this, face to face. However, you might be in a situation where you need something that you couldn't do face to face, and that changes things a little bit. This way also students don't have to learn a tool. And it used an existing resource. So again, I kind of used one of the resources that was available from the Center for Workforce Development there at Clemson to kind of be like, hey, like we can use this now in lieu of actually going and doing that face-to-face, in-person, authentic experience. So and you'll see one of the reasons why the students don't have to learn the tool, and it doesn't necessarily require any extra peripherals either. Awesome. Thank you, Tammy, for dropping that in the chat right now. So this one to me, and this is back again to why I mentioned that about like SAMR being contextual, because if we're saying that, we're subsuming that we're replacing what we would usually go, face to face and do this activity, technically we're just replacing it, right? We just replaced a no tech environment. So that's substitution. So one of the reasons why I also kind of contextualized that example that way was just to emphasize that substitution is not always a bad thing. It might, on that SAMR framework, it might seem like it's low tech, like, low on the priority or low on that depth, but it really does allow for you to, to do this task that let's say would be otherwise impossible right now. Also, let's say that you're teaching, like this type of experience online. This would be probably more so in a redefinition because you couldn't take those people. So like, let's say if, the context that I would have given is that usually you give written scenarios or like, just a picture and they have to identify. This changes that dramatically. So that would, it's no longer just substitution, because really, like I wanted to say, but wait, there's more. Substitution, again, isn't always a bad thing. All right, so really quickly, I'm gonna run through like this little example too. It actually uses discussions and maybe a little bit of stuff that that we've kind of talked about through this presentation so far. So this is actually from one of my courses that I teach. It's a course on human performance improvement. So the idea is that human performance improvement is kind of like it's our systematic process and our systemic viewpoint of like performance problems as they kind of occur in the workplace, and they occur in any workplace or any environment where there's performance occurring, which is almost everything. So within this course, we have these students having to kind of go through these HPI case studies and evaluate them. So these are like when people are reporting on like, hey, here was the performance problem. Here's the process we used to identify what the causes were. Here's the solutions that we put into place, and then kind of here's what happened after. So they have these case studies that they're going through. So the objective is that students are going to need to be able to evaluate the approach and identify, through their evaluation, they're identifying 3 weaknesses and 3 strengths essentially. So when we're thinking about like what's the objective, what's the activity, like the students need the opportunity to review and share these case studies. And so like one way that you can kind of think about it is that these students are like looking at one case study a piece. And so here's where this the kind of the tech and the tool kind of change things up. So I kind of integrated not only like discussions, because like discussion boards, like if we think about like the built-in feature in like a LMS or something, it's pretty simple, right? Like it's just us, it's just threaded responses. But what we've done is we've actually forced students to turn it into a teaching presentation essentially, so that they actually have to present over the case, and they have to, as they're kind of sharing about what the case is, they're identifying those strengths and weaknesses and talking about how that applies to what they're doing or what they're considering, or it applies to that overarching HPI process. So instead of just having students evaluate a case and write on it and then turn that into us, we kind of have them teach each other about these individual cases, and we do that in like small groups. And so we allow them to do, we kind of like turn them loose here. So we say like, you can do anything. Like I've had students make a podcast before, very, entertaining, very exciting. Like it's a way to also allow for, creativity, to flow through. Also, we're an instructional, design and technology program where we're teaching this, this broader course. So I like to, anytime that students have an opportunity to create learning materials, I think it's good practice. So those are kind of like the considerations that I took into account when, kind of making that instructional decision to integrate these specific tools. And since we allow, like, we do have like a list of tools. So like, I just included like 2 in the example, but we leave it up to students and they're able to use the same tool throughout. So it's up to them. They're not required to learn a new tool, but if a student's feeling like a challenge, they can. So it's their choice. And we make sure to only use free resources, make sure that they only use resources that are free and available to all students in the class. Because sometimes they'll want to use, a product that's only available to students to like teachers, other learners in their district, and that kind of presents some access issues. So we don't allow those types of tools to be used. And so really, like, this is going to be kind of a modification, because again, based on that context, we really kind of we went past augmented, and we've really modified kind of what the task itself is. So not only now they're not just evaluating, they're actually having to teach their evaluation or share their evaluation as in their instructional process. Okay, so to just kind of like, as we're kind of wrapping up, so this is not my advice. I'll always take a deep breath, but definitely don't give up when you're thinking about like what type of media should I select. I will say that this is probably, in this past year, I believe the oversaturation of our instructional, like the instructional tools that are available to us, like we were at saturation. Now we're so oversaturated, because like lots of organizations saw an opportunity to capitalize, move tools out like that they might have been holding back on when COVID occurred. So there's tons of tools that are available, but really, I think, my advice is going to align with kind of what some of you were talking about, where some of your considerations that you use when picking instructional tools to integrate. First, big one, use that support that is provided. So like whether that supports through like, these webinars, through some of the other resources, through a Center for Teaching and Learning, pick these, use tools that you're going to have some support network with, or that don't require a lot of work. All right. So the other thing, and I don't think this happens as much in higher ed, and you all can correct me if you think I'm wrong. I know in K-12, you'll throw a lot of tools at teachers, and they feel obligated to use those tools. That's not the case. Like, you should pick some tools that really are meaningful and effective. So the tools that help you do what you need to get done and don't have this extraneous information or features that you don't need built in within them. Pick those really like, efficient, and those, there's a better word that's escaping me, but pick those tools that really are simplistic, but elegant, that are elegant because they really allow you to do what you need to do without any extra. So pick those, and then, just pick a few. Don't feel the need to integrate all of these different types of tools in one instance. It's always good advice to kind of, think, again, think about your objective and then kind of move from there, and, have just like maybe a small library that you start to build more and more as you, as you're practicing and you're integrating these tools. Okay. So with that being said, let me throw some resources at you all. So I'm just going to show you. So I've got 4 things that I wanted to just really briefly just kind of to show you. So I'm going to stop this presentation and I'm going to pop over here. So hopefully you all kind of see my screen has changed, and I'm actually going to throw these in chat as I go. And of course you'll have access to these slides after with the links embedded in them. I just had them pulled up so y'all don't have to see me click through. So this digital tools resource page, this is actually a page. So my wife is she's an instructional technologist. So she's a trained instructional designer as well, but she's also a science teacher. And so she and I actually do a lot of work with K-12 instructors, or K-12 teachers on, integrating technology tools and, in technology tool selection. So this list here is just a number of free tools. Some of them do have paid versions, but just some free tools that are really good and that can really do a lot. And so, like I said, I won't go into each of them, but they're definitely they're worth checking out. And then at the second page, you'll kind of see we kind of categorized the tools just based on what you're looking for. So you can kind of see, kind of get an idea of like, okay, I need something that, lets me assess individual students and collect data on that. Well, I might use Kahoot, Quizzes, or Edpuzzle. So again, like I said, don't feel obligated to use any of these. This is just one of the resources that like I had readily available to share. I will say that like a Nearpod is probably one of the biggest that's kind of hitting K-12 because one thing about Nearpod too, Nearpod allows you to integrate virtual reality within it, but it's certain virtual reality, and it has to be kind of pre-existing. You can make them, of course, but so it's kind of like from a library. But Nearpod you can kind of do it all with Nearpod, so it's a pretty good one. But it does have a paid version that does make things a little more complicated, but a free version also lets you accomplish a lot. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to show you all, so I know that, again, and Tammy already posted and actually here, let me drop this link in here too, sorry. So this is this is kind of the Bloom's taxonomy. So you can kind of see the Bloom's taxonomy is what's living there in the middle. And so here's your verbs, and then here's kind of some activities that you would do. And then this person has included some technological tools that you can kind of already consider. But what I like so much about this, and this will be kind of my hammering home point in just a second too, is that it starts with the objective, and you really don't start thinking about those tools until you kind of move out to your objective. Additionally, what's really cool about it is that it kind of aligns that, as we get deeper into SAM-R, as we're getting into redefinition and things like that, we're getting into those higher level behaviors in Bloom's, which is more than likely what is going to occur. The other 2 resources that I wanted to provide, I think, actually, I'm not going to throw these links in because I believe Tammy has already thrown both of them in. But here's the simulation library. So when I was kind of coming up with the example of thinking about, that manufacturing safety, I use this as kind of inspiration for that. And then the other, which I don't think you have thrown this one in, Tammy, so I will happily, is this here, kind of, it's like a migration to e-learning FAQ. It has a lot of good information in here about selecting different types of tools and specifically selecting at different levels, as well as what are some resources available to you all. All right. Okay, so I kind of already, I feel like I've given this away a lot. So the thing that I hope that you all kind of can leave this this experience with is that let your design, and specifically let that objective, thinking about what is it that I want my students to be able to do, let that be the foremost guide in your selection of media and tools that you're using. So with that kind of wraps it up for me. So of course I'm gonna this is kind of any questions that you all might have, I'm happy to stick around and help. And yeah, so thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to answering any questions you may have.
Well, if as we wait for those questions, I have a question, Dr. Arrington. So in the instructional process, does less equal to more? Because as you mentioned, there are so many tools available out there. So does less equal to more?
Yeah, I think my advice would be using a few tools well using a few tools. I had a great saying for this last night, Tammy, and now I've forgotten it. But it's using a few tools well is so much better than using a lot of tools and then them not being used to either their fullest or being used or only using them like certain features of them. Like that then you have all this extra stuff that's going on that you've lost.
Well, thank you. And my next question is, what are the challenges that you've come across when you've presented to your students, and what are the tools that they are most likely to use and be comfortable with?
That's a great question. So I think one of the biggest challenges is I teach, I'm using my context of thinking about these K-12 teachers. Like I teach teachers across the world, but most of them are in the state of Georgia. But in the state of Georgia, we have very drastically different environments. So access is that biggest thing. So not just access for my students, because really almost any time that I use a tool in my course, I kind of have two purposes. My one purpose is to get them to engage them in their use of that tool, but then hopefully it's not necessarily my modeling, but they're hopefully learning from the modeling of each other on how to integrate that into their own practice. So I would say that that's the biggest challenge is access, and there's certain things that they're just not going to have access to, based on kind of just the positioning of their school. So whether what funding level their school has available. Some of the tools that like I enjoy using the most, like I said, anytime that I can have them create something. So, we use Google Slides a lot, and we do a lot of bells and whistles in Google Slides. We do a lot of like linking out, use VoiceThread a lot. So anything that we like, again, I can kind of get them thinking about creating. Another big thing, a lot of my students love creating instructional websites. So using like a web structure to create like learning material, because it's a really, especially if you don't have, which most schools have LMSs, but an instructional like website can go a long way in conjunction with an LMS.
And I believe we have another question by Zach. He mentioned, what's a good way to evaluate the effectiveness of a tool to meet your objective?
Yeah, that's a great question, Zach. So I think that, the first thing that you want to think about is like, obviously, okay, so what's my objective and what's that behavior? So like, let's say if the behavior is something like that they're creating, then, you want a tool that allows them to create, not necessarily maybe a tool that allows them to synthesize, So again, it's really going to be based on what's that, like what level of behavior you really are kind of targeting. I think the other aspect of it is like, I mean, honestly, the behavior is the driving piece because that's our observable piece of our objective. The other that goes along with that are kind of those other kind of considerations. So like, once we've kind of identified that, we could identify a perfect tool, but it could have a lot of other issues as far as our objective, like as far as outside of our objective. So that's when those secondary characteristics or considerations rather come into play. But I think really the biggest part for me is like, I'm going to say, okay, my students need to be able to do X. And then I'm going to look at that tool and be like, okay, does this allow them to do X? Does it allow them to practice X? And go from there. So that's, to me, that's the biggest, the kind of one criteria is that if it allows that, then we can kind of move into our secondary considerations.
I believe we have another question. Is virtual reality being exported at all for everything it brings to the table, or is the technology getting in its own way?
Yeah, and so I think I see so like is VR being exploited? So I think that's a great question. So I think virtual reality is awesome. I think that it's it's such an eye catch too. Just to kind of talking about like our experience at the mobile lab and that experience, taking those tools. Anything with VR is always the immediate like pickup. We go to community events as well, and seeing like senior citizens, use virtual reality and just being awestruck is amazing. However, what I would always argue, and I fall on the side of this debate, is that really virtual reality is just that tool. And so it's like you have to still have well-designed instruction behind it. So if you don't have that well-designed instruction, I would say that VR is exploited because it's just being used to integrate technology or integrate it for its own purposes. So my kind of response to that is I think virtual reality is used a lot because of all those reasons. But the driving point for me would be is that, what's your design? Like you have to have a meaningful design, and that virtual reality has to build upon that meaningful design.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Arrington, for this informative session and for spending your valuable time with us today. Unless there are any other questions, I'd like to thank everyone who has participated in today's webinar. If you think of any additional questions, feel free to contact us at cucwd@clemson.edu. And we will do our best to respond to all your queries. Hopefully you found this webinar to be valuable, and you will be able to leverage all the information provided to enhance the learning experiences for your learners. Your feedback is very important to us. We request you to spend a few minutes of your time completing our post-webinar survey, which will be sent shortly to your inboxes. Our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, March the 23rd at 2 p.m. EST. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Jeffrey Bertrand from CUCWD. In this webinar, we will focus on the development process for a typical virtual reality simulation, and describe how educators can use online virtual simulations in a browser-based format without the need for special equipment. So do plug in. We also encourage you to visit our CUCWD website. I have posted the link in the chat thread. You will find our programs and webinar series. Once again, thanks to you all for your time and active participation. And we look forward to seeing you all in our next webinar. So have a great rest of your day and stay safe and healthy.